Welcome back, everybody. My name is Taylor Martin. This is the best Damn EDC, and it's time for another video. And today, I'm going to show you how I maintain my knives. So as you guys know, I got a bunch of knives. Sometimes they get gunked up. They don't work like they should. They're not smooth. You struggle to open them, especially if they're on bearings and it's a flipper. So sometimes you got to tear it apart and do some cleaning. And this is how I do that to my knives. So with that said, let's do the damn thing. So here on the table, I have a couple of knives. They don't really need to be maintained, but I guess we're going to do this anyway. I also have this mat that I just picked up. I've been wanting a mat like this to do some knife maintenance on and other work. This is just mainly for organizing your stuff while you're working, so you can put, body screws and pivot screws and keep everything just kind of organized while you're working. They also make magnetic trays, which are really nice sometimes, but a lot of the hardware on knives is sometimes titanium. It's not going to matter if it's magnetic or not if you have titanium hardware. So I didn't go with a magnetic mat or anything, just a standard little rubber mat that's really grippy on the bottom side. But before I take one of these knives apart, I want to show you my little kit. So I carry this in my backpack back and forth between home and the office because I just like to randomly take my knives apart sometimes. It's not very well refined. It's in some neoprene case that I just had at home, and I would like to get maybe like a Maxpedition or something. But here I have knife pivot lube and knife pivot lube heavy. I use these for different things when maintaining knives. I also have a little twist tube or a glue stick of Loctite. I have a bronze driver from Combat Beads. I have a little baggie of Weehaw bits, a microfiber cloth, some alcohol prep pads, and a Weehaw driver kit. So you'll notice I have two drivers in here. And the reason I have two drivers is because some knives have free spinning backspacers or standoffs or pivots. And sometimes, especially if they're Loctited, you need to twist from both sides. And I recommended this Weehaw kit in my Christmas gift guide video, and I still like it. But I've learned that on some knives, I just can't get quite enough torque. There's just not enough here to grip comfortably to get enough torque to pop some of the pivot screws. So when that's the case, I like a little heavier driver that I can be a little more precise with. It still works great. I still use this often more than the other drivers that I have. But I've learned that I do prefer something a little chunkier that I can grip a little better, especially when the pivot screw is being a little stubborn, if you will. So I actually decided to show you this hinderer and how I'm going to disassemble and maintain this one for a couple of reasons. First and foremost, it's a pretty interesting knife. It's got different hardware than a lot of other things. And I also have a Swiss Army knife here because I would use either a pry tool or the flathead on a Swiss Army to disassemble the pivot on this knife because it's a large slotted screw instead of a Torx, which is very interesting and honestly something I really prefer about these hinderers. I love that it's a slotted screw because if I'm out and about and I'm using the knife and this starts to come undone just a little bit and I have a little blade play or anything, I can tune it on the fly with either a Swiss Army knife or pry tool, which is very, very nice. You can't do that unless you carry a Torx bit around with other knives. To get started, I usually start with the pivot screw. On this one, you can't really decide which side to start on. You're going to start on that scale side, not the lock side, and just totally remove this. The thing about this hinderer pivot screw is that it's big and it's threaded all the way through, so lots of threads on this one. And once that's out, I just place that in one of these compartments. And then next we have a T6, and I'm just going to undo those very quickly. Now, if you do have Loctite on these, it's important to note that you do not want to strip these body screws. I mean, that's kind of obvious, but if you do have Loctite, it's best to heat them up in a way, either with a hair dryer sometimes. I've heard that works. With certain knives, I can just dip them in some really hot water and leave them there for a minute. And then another option is to take a soldering iron and touch it to the head of the screw, and that will help loosen up that Loctite. So move the scale out of the way. This we're not going to need for a minute. And then disengage the lock, and that will usually pop off the scale. Something different about this knife is that it doesn't just have these phosphor bronze washers in here. I'll put these up here. It's got these spacers in here, but just keep all of your hardware organized. We can use the different slots on this mat. This one is going to stay in there because of that. But once you have the knife disassembled, the biggest thing is just cleaning it up, getting any of those oils off. I use these alcohol pads because I have a bunch of them just sitting around the office. So I like to keep some of them in my maintenance kit. But just wipe down any place that might be dirty or gunky. Get any of the residual oils off, and any of the bearings or standoffs or any of the hardware, really. Just get them nice and clean. You may also want to dry them off. That's why I have a little microfiber in here. Isopropyl is pretty good about evaporating quickly, though. If you're diehard about it, you may also want to pay attention to the orientation and which side your washers come out of, mainly because one side of your washer will wear while the other won't. But this one I'm not really concerned about because, as I mentioned, these little spacers are specific to the hinderer, because you don't normally see these in a knife. You normally just have your phosphor bronze washers or Teflon washers or bearings. But with the newer generation XM18s and XM24s, you get a selection. You get bearings as well as Teflon washers or phosphor bronze. If you decide to use the Teflon or phosphor bronze, you have to use these spacers. But if you use the bearings, you can leave those in there and get rid of the spacers. So what I'm actually going to do is, I've been running this on the phosphor bronze for a few days. I'm actually going to put these up and put it back on bearings, just because. So once everything's cleaned up, you just want to put your pivot screw back in, making sure to put the right side in the correct scale. So with bearings, it's kind of weird because they're caged, and you can see that the lip is facing up right now, and then this side is closed off. And I've seen it come both ways from a bunch of different manufacturers. I've taken apart a bunch of knives, and sometimes the cage is facing the blade, sometimes it's facing the scale, and I don't know which way is technically correct. But the way I tend to do it is cage away from the knife, only because I feel like if there is gunk in there, it's getting gunked on the opposite side of the knife. I don't know if there's any science to that. Probably not. I don't know, but this is what I do. I put the cage away from the knife. Maybe I'm wrong. I use a little bit of this normal, the original KPL, just a little dab on either side. Place the knife on here. Might have to engage the lock just to get the knife seated. And then once again, we're going to put just a dab of oil. Just a dab. It doesn't take very much. Cage away from the blade. And then this is the tricky part, especially with this knife, because these are free spinning and nothing holding them in place. Your little standoffs. Oh, almost forgot the stop pin. This actually is not a stop pin for the open position, it's stop pin for the closed position. Your stop pin for the open position on the hinderer is actually the thumb stud. And once this is back on, I'm going to just hand turn a few of these body screws just to keep the standoffs from, or the Chicago screws from coming undone. This is just to keep it from falling apart. For now, I'm not going to fully tighten it down. We're going to go with the pivot. We're going to tighten that one fully to start with. I've got just a little bit of Loctite here. Doesn't take a lot. This is mainly just to keep the screw in place and from running itself loose. You don't need to really lock it down. This stuff is, I've found, a little more difficult to work with in terms of how much you apply, but it's easier to work with than the liquid, because the liquid just kind of gets everywhere. And you just want to, the scale just seems like it's off. It is off. Why is it off? There we go. The scale was just ever so slightly off. Okay, so run this pivot screw in until it's tight. You're gonna just cinch it down. Blade action should be pretty tight, actually, but I have it on bearings. There's zero blade play, and it's not quite centered, but we also have to finish tightening down the body screws. The reason I didn't tighten them all the way down is because I will put just a dab of Loctite on each, not much, because I have had these body screws work themselves out. Yeah, you definitely don't have to glob the Loctite on this. Mainly once I'm at this point, all I do is check for blade play, which I've never really had an issue with this. The centering is off compared to what it was. It was perfect before, and I'm not exactly sure what I've changed other than putting in the bearings. So if your blade centering is off, a lot of people can kind of blow that out of proportion. It's nice to have a blade that's totally centered, especially on a very high-end knife, but it's not really that big of an issue if your blade isn't moving, if there's no blade play, and if the blade is not rubbing the scales, then it's not too terribly bad of an issue, but you can correct it. One, if you have a loosened pivot because you want that drop shut action, drop shut isn't all that important. You can tighten it down a little bit, and that may fix your blade centering. But one of the biggest things you can do is actually put some tension on the blade in the opposite direction you want the blade to go, right? So open the blade and engage the lock. And let's say the blade is a little favoring the scale side a little bit, because that's what it tends to do because you've got tension from the lock bar when it's in the closed position. And what you want to do is push towards the side that it is. So the reason is you have it open, so the blade is actually rotated 180 degrees. So you want to push in the direction that the blade was going when it was closed and just loosen the body screws. You don't have to push very hard. You're just putting a little bit of tension on the blade and then tighten those body screws back down. This puts just a little bit of tension in the right direction on the frame, and that should help correct those centering issues, and now the blade is centered. So you have a fully tightened pivot, no blade play whatsoever. These screws are all Loctited, and the blade is just flying open. I almost forgot this step. One last thing that I do is I put just a tiny dab. So this is KPL heavy. I come in here on the detent ball and I squeeze just a tiny little bit of KPL heavy on the detent ball. And what that does is put just a little bit of lubrication on the detent track. You'll notice a little bit of smoothness, especially with this one I had with this Parkerized blade on that ceramic detent ball. I was getting squeaking, and it was just every time I would close the knife, it was squeaking like. And now with a little bit of KPL heavy, that doesn't happen. Much smoother knife, especially now that it's on the bearings instead of phosphor bronze. But there you go. That's how I maintain my knives. One more thing you might want to do is run it across some ceramic and hone it a little bit and then strop it. But for now, that's all I do to maintain my knives every couple of weeks if I've been carrying it a lot. That's going to do it for this video. If you found it helpful and you enjoyed it, be sure to hit that thumbs up button down below and subscribe to see more stuff like this in the future, and hit that notification bell so you're notified when I upload new videos. And if you want to support what I'm doing here, you can click the links in the description down below. Everything you saw in this video will be linked down below. Usually those are affiliate links, so if you purchase anything using those links, that will give me a little bit of a kickback, but it won't cost you anything extra. So it's the best of both worlds. But you can also go to patreon.com/bestdamnedc to support there, or you can go to carrycommission.com or carry.best. That is my store where you can buy gear and merch directly from me. But of course, be sure to follow us around the web. You can find us on Twitter and Instagram at bestdamnedc. There is now also a Facebook group and a page and a Discord server. All of that is linked down below. So be sure to join, follow, and become part of this awesome community. But with that said, and until next time, carry on.